BrainWave.
On some rock paintings, you can see slaves and slave owners. But how and why did this phenomenon arise? Let's try to understand. We all know that ancient people primarily survived through hunting. They didn't know how to produce food independently. However, as humanity developed and acquired new knowledge, ancient people realized that producing food themselves was much more convenient than spending weeks hunting for prey. Moreover, it was safer. Ancient people settled in one place, started raising livestock and cultivating crops. They no longer faced the constant threat of starvation from hunting, but children and the elderly still suffered. As tribes grew in size, division of labor emerged. People began selecting leaders, rulers, and protectors. With the widespread adoption of division of labor, people realized they didn't need to do everything themselves. Stronger tribes would attack weaker ones, capturing them instead of simply killing or robbing them as they might have done before. These captured tribes became slaves, forced to perform labor for their captors. Slaves took on roles as domestic servants, craftsmen, and mentors. The entire system of public works in empires relied on slaves and hired laborers. Slaves were widely used in cultivating olives, grapes, and other cash crops. Small farmers and free laborers were often pushed off their land, contributing to the growing population of urban poor, a characteristic of Roman life. During this time, there were no laws specifically regulating slavery. The ruler's opinions mattered more than skin color, religion, or anatomy. Anyone could be a slave or free. However, a significant shift occurred in human thinking when, in 1619, English traders brought around 20 Africans from the Congo to British Virginia, exchanging them for provisions. This event marked the beginning of the British and American transatlantic slave trade. Initially, there were no laws regarding slavery in North American colonies. Legal relationships related to slave ownership were determined by courts or mutual agreements among colonists. Only in 1641 in Massachusetts was an act passed allowing the purchase of slaves from outside the colony and the enslavement of prisoners of war, criminals, and those who willingly agreed. Over time, similar laws appeared in other colonies. Most people became slaves after being captured during wars and sold by slave traders. Poverty and the threat of starvation sometimes led parents to sell their children into slavery, and occasionally, people voluntarily became slaves. Researchers estimate that, accounting for inflation, a slave in the 19th century would be worth $10,000 to $40,000 in today's terms. Only affluent individuals could afford to own slaves. The price of a slave depended on their age, gender, physical qualities, health, and skills. Slaves were divided into two categories: those who worked on plantations and those who worked in households. Plantation work was grueling. Slaves toiled for 18 to 19 hours a day under inhumane conditions. They were poorly fed and engaged in various tasks beyond cotton cultivation, including growing corn, sweet potatoes, and potatoes. The domestic slaves, often with lighter skin and more education, served as household attendants. Black servants were constantly near their owners, caring for children, preparing meals, and performing other duties. Being a domestic slave was preferable to field work, and they faced fewer punishments. If a white person encountered a black slave outside the plantation, they could demand a pass from the slave. If the slave didn't have one, they could receive 20 lashes. Slaves endured mistreatment and were forbidden from resisting or answering back. Another form of punishment was branding, which marked ownership and served as a deterrent. Escaped slaves were often branded as punishment. These marks, usually on the face, permanently prevented them from becoming domestic slaves. Chains and shackles were also common symbols of slavery, further dehumanizing the enslaved. Slaves had almost no rights, They were literal property of their owners. Owners could do anything to them without consequence. Slaves were considered inferior, and they could be executed for crimes that wouldn't result in death penalties for whites. They couldn't own property, move without their owner's consent, or marry illegally. In 1772, England abolished slavery, granting freedom to any slave who set foot on English soil. However, slavery persisted in British colonies in the Caribbean, where sugar plantations yielded immense profits. In the United States, the transatlantic slave trade was officially banned in 1807, but illegal shipments of African slaves continued until the mid-19th century. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the northern U.S. had abolished slavery, while the southern states actively expanded it. Enslaved individuals of African descent fled en masse from the South to the North in pursuit of freedom. The conflict between the North and the South continued to escalate. Abraham Lincoln, a presidential candidate, promised to halt the spread of slavery, but would not attempt to abolish it where it was already established, as the Constitution prevented presidential interference in state affairs. However, when Lincoln was elected president in 1860, most slaveholding states decided that the threat was too great to remain in the Union. They seceded, forming the Confederacy, which led to a prolonged and bloody conflict. Lincoln declared secession illegal, and the resulting clashes culminated in the U.S. Civil War from 1861 to 1865. Even during this time, mistreatment and severe punishments persisted for poorly performing slaves. However, not everyone accepted their fate. Some chose to escape. One such runaway slave was Peter, also known as Gordon. In March 1863, he fled a plantation, rubbing his body with onions to evade tracking by dogs and bloodhounds. Over 10 days, he covered more than 200 kilometers, reaching a Union Army camp. At that time, the U.S. was embroiled in the Civil War, and since the Union Army opposed slavery, they accepted and assisted Peter. Slavery was officially abolished in 1865 after the Civil War, following the victory of the North, led by President Abraham Lincoln. The 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution closed one of the darkest chapters in American and global history. However, despite their newfound freedom, Black individuals continued to face discrimination and limited rights, similar to second-class citizens. These conditions persisted until the mid-20th century, when efforts finally equalized the rights of Black and white people. According to estimates, approximately 12 million people were transported from Africa to America during the existence of slavery. Unfortunately, slavery has not been eradicated worldwide. Even today, in some countries, women, men, and children are stolen, forced into labor, and coerced into prostitution. Some people still live in bondage. I hope you found this information interesting. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to stay updated on more fascinating stories.